The blue and red lights from the patrol car painted the rain-slicked street with an eerie glow. An old black man stood calmly by his worn-out pickup truck, his hands raised slightly in the air. His face was lined with years of experience, but his expression remained neutral, unreadable even, as two white police officers barked orders at him. "Get on the ground," one of the officers shouted, his hand resting on the holster of his gun. "I'm not resisting," the man said in a deep, steady voice. "There's no need for this." But his words fell on deaf ears. Officer Daniels, the younger of the two, stepped forward, baton in hand. His partner, Officer Myers, stayed back, his gaze fixed on the man as though he were a threat rather than a citizen in need of assistance. They had stopped him on suspicion of theft, though the truck was clearly his, and the supposed stolen item was a simple duffel bag in the passenger seat. "Did I stutter?" Daniels growled. "I said, get on the ground." The old man sighed and slowly moved to comply. As he kneeled on the pavement, his neatly pressed khakis soaked through with water, he asked calmly, "Do you even know who I am?" Daniels scoffed. "Yeah, I know exactly who you are. Another punk who thinks the law doesn't apply to him." "Sir, please," the man said again, his voice measured. "I've done nothing wrong." But before he could finish, Daniels shoved him to the ground. The man's hat, a simple black cap embroidered with a faint golden emblem, fell off and landed in a puddle. Myers moved in to cuff him as Daniels searched the duffel bag, flinging it open. Inside were papers, medals, and a pristine dress uniform adorned with stars. Daniels froze, the arrogance on his face giving way to confusion. He pulled out a badge, its sheen undeniable even in the rain. "What the hell is this?" he muttered. Myers glanced over, and his face turned pale. "Wait a minute. Is this what I think it is?" The man, still face down on the ground, turned his head slightly to look at them. His gaze was piercing, yet his voice remained unervingly calm. "Yes," he said. "It is." Daniels stumbled back, staring at the uniform. Myers picked up the cap, examining the emblem. "Oh my God," he whispered, his hands shaking. "You're General Warren Ellis." "That's right," the man replied, his tone laced with quiet authority. "Retired 5-star General of the United States Army." For a moment, silence engulfed the scene, broken only by the soft patter of rain. The officers exchanged panicked glances, realizing the gravity of their mistake. But before they could say anything, the voice crackling through their radios shattered the tension. "Dispatch to Unit 4B, the operator said. "Be advised, General Ellis is a confirmed VIP and an honored war hero. He's also the keynote speaker at tonight's Veterans Gala. Stand down immediately." Daniels fumbled for his radio. "You, copy that, dispatch." The old man slowly rose to his feet, brushing dirt from his hands. His piercing gaze locked onto Daniels, who now looked more like a scared boy than an officer of the law. "You should have listened," Ellis said, his voice cold. And then, with a subtle but deliberate gesture, he reached for the inside pocket of his jacket. Daniels, still on edge, reflexively drew his gun, pointing it at the general. "Don't move." The general froze, his hand mid-reach. The tension hung in the air like a razor, and for a brief, horrifying moment, it seemed like everything might spiral out of control. And then, Ellis spoke, his words cutting through the silence like a blade. "Are you going to shoot me, Officer Daniels? Or are you going to let me show you my credentials?" The camera freezes on Daniels' trembling hands, the rain streaking his face. Daniels' hands trembled as his finger hovered near the trigger. Myers placed a shaky hand on his partner's shoulder, his voice low but urgent. "Daniels, put the gun down. For God's sake, do you know what you're doing?" Daniels hesitated, his gaze shifting between the general and the gun in his own hand. Finally, he lowered it, though his expression was still a mix of confusion and defiance. "Credentials," he muttered. "Let's see them." General Ellis slowly reached into his pocket, careful to make no sudden movements, and pulled out a leather case. He flipped it open, revealing a government-issued ID with the unmistakable title, Retired General of the United States Army, Warren Ellis. The reality of the situation hit Daniels like a truck. Myers stepped back, his face pale. This can't be happening," he stammered. "We just cuffed one of the highest-ranking war heroes in the country." Ellis tucked the ID back into his jacket and folded his arms, his stance as steady as a mountain. "I gave you both ample opportunity to reconsider," he said evenly. "You chose not to listen." Daniels, still clutching the duffel bag, looked down at the uniform inside. His eyes darted between the medals and the 5 stars on the shoulders, the weight of his actions finally settling on him. I didn't know," he stuttered. Ellis' voice was calm but carried an unmistakable edge. "You didn't want to know. You looked at me and made up your mind before I even spoke." The words hung heavy in the air, their truth undeniable. Daniels opened his mouth to respond, but no words came. Myers, sensing the tension, tried to salvage the situation. "General Ellis," he said, his tone desperate, "this was a misunderstanding. We thought—" "You thought what?" Ellis interrupted, his tone sharper now. "That I couldn't possibly be someone of value because of the color of my skin? That I was guilty before proven innocent?" Myers shifted uncomfortably, unable to meet the general's piercing gaze. Daniels, however, bristled, his defensive instincts kicking in. "Hey, we were doing our job. You were acting suspicious." "Suspicious?" Ellis cut him off, his voice rising. "I was parked on the side of the road with a flat tire, waiting for roadside assistance. I told you exactly what was happening, but you refused to hear me." Daniels opened his mouth to argue, but Myers shot him a warning glance. "Shut up, Daniels," he hissed under his breath. Turning back to Ellis, Myers said, "Sir, we sincerely apologize for this. We didn't realize who you were." Ellis' expression didn't soften. "You shouldn't have needed to know who I was. My rights don't depend on my title." For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the sound of rain splashing against the pavement. Then Ellis stepped forward, picking up his soaked cap from the ground. He adjusted it on his head, the golden emblem gleaming under the streetlights. "You know," Ellis said, his voice quieter now but no less commanding, "I've seen men face death on the battlefield. I've seen them bleed and sacrifice everything for this country. And I've seen the same prejudice you showed me today infect those who should be serving and protecting." Myers swallowed hard, the weight of the general's words pressing down on him. Daniels, however, still looked defiant, though his posture betrayed his unease. "Look," Daniels said, his voice strained, "if you want to file a complaint, go ahead. But you're not going to stand here and lecture us." Ellis tilted his head, a faint smile playing on his lips, though it wasn't one of amusement. "A complaint," he echoed. "Oh, Officer Daniels, this is far beyond a complaint." At that moment, headlights swept over the scene as a black SUV pulled up. The driver's door opened, and a sharply dressed man stepped out, his demeanor one of controlled urgency. He approached quickly, his shoes splashing through puddles. "General Ellis," the man said, saluting crisply. "I'm Major Sanderson. We were informed of the situation and came as quickly as we could." Ellis nodded. "Major, thank you for arriving." Sanderson turned to the 2 officers, his expression cold. "What, exactly, is the meaning of this?" he demanded. "You've detained a retired 5-star general? Do you have any idea what you've done?" Daniels stepped back, his face flushing. Myers tried to explain, his words tripping over each other. It was a mistake. We didn't know." "You didn't know," Sanderson repeated, his tone icy. "That much is clear. But ignorance is no excuse for misconduct." Daniels' temper flared. "We were just doing our jobs," he snapped. "We thought he was a suspect." Sanderson's eyes narrowed. "A suspect? Based on what evidence?" Daniels faltered, unable to answer. Ellis stepped forward, his gaze never leaving Daniels. "This isn't just about me," he said. "This is about every person who's been treated the same way, without rank or medals to protect them. You saw a black man on the side of the road and assumed the worst. That's what this is about." Daniels looked away, his jaw tightening. Myers, meanwhile, seemed on the verge of collapse. "We're sorry, General," Myers said quietly. "Truly." Ellis regarded him for a long moment before speaking. "Sorry doesn't fix the system that allows this to happen." Sanderson gestured toward the SUV. "General, if you're ready, we can escort you to the gala." Ellis nodded but didn't move just yet. Instead, he turned back to Daniels and Myers. "I hope this moment stays with you," he said. Because if it doesn't, someone else will be in my position tomorrow. And they might not walk away as I did. He walked toward the SUV, leaving the two officers standing in the rain, their faces a mix of guilt, shame, and denial. As Ellis climbed into the vehicle, Daniels muttered under his breath, "Who does he think he is?" Sanderson, overhearing, stopped and turned. His voice was steady but firm as he said, "He's the reason you have the freedom to wear that badge." The SUV's door closed, and it drove off into the night, leaving the officers alone in their failure. As the black SUV carrying General Ellis disappeared into the night, the two officers stood in stunned silence. The rain had stopped, but the air was thick with tension. Myers shifted uneasily, rubbing the back of his neck, while Daniels paced in tight circles, muttering to himself. "I can't believe this," Daniels said finally, breaking the silence. "Do you know how this is going to look? We're going to be crucified for this." Myers glanced at his partner, his voice low and trembling. "Maybe we deserve to be. You heard what he said, Daniels. He wasn't wrong." Daniels stopped pacing and spun to face Myers. "Don't start with that guilt trip crap. We followed procedure." "Did we?" Myers shot back, his voice growing firmer. "What procedure tells you to treat someone like a criminal because they're black? What part of the handbook says to ignore everything they say and throw them on the ground?" Daniels' face twisted in frustration. "You want to throw me under the bus, too? Fine. Go ahead, play the moral hero. But don't pretend like you weren't right there with me." Myers opened his mouth to respond, but stopped when the crackle of their radio interrupted. "Unit 4B, report to the station immediately for debriefing." The two exchanged a glance. Myers sighed heavily. "We're in for it now." Daniels smirked bitterly. "Good. Let's go explain to the captain how we just made national headlines." By the time they arrived at the station, word had already spread. The other officers avoided eye contact as Myers and Daniels walked through the precinct. Conversations hushed and heads turned, but no one said a word. Inside the captain's office, Captain Riley sat at his desk, his expression grim. The door closed behind Daniels and Myers with an ominous click. "Sit down," Riley said, his tone leaving no room for argument. The two officers obeyed, the weight of their actions pressing down on them like an anvil. Riley leaned forward, his hands clasped tightly on the desk. "Do you have any idea what you've done?" he asked, his voice dangerously calm. "Captain, Daniels started, but Riley raised a hand to silence him. "Save it," Riley snapped. "I've spent the last hour on the phone with city officials, the mayor's office, and the Department of Defense. Do you know how hard it was to explain why two of my officers manhandled a five-star general?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't know who he was." "That's not the point," Riley thundered, slamming his fist on the desk. "This isn't just about who he is. It's about why you treated him the way you did. Do you honestly think this was about following procedure?" Myers finally spoke, his voice heavy with regret. "Captain, I don't have an excuse. We messed up. Big time." Riley's gaze softened slightly as he turned to Myers. "At least you have the decency to admit it." Daniels, on the other hand, bristled. "So, what now? Are we just supposed to roll over and let everyone paint us as racists?" Riley's eyes narrowed. "Do you think that's what this is about? Protecting your reputation? Let me tell you something, Daniels. This precinct doesn't tolerate what you did out there. If you can't understand why this is a problem, then you don't belong here." Daniels' face darkened. "You're throwing us under the bus." "Got it. Enough," Riley barked. "You're both suspended pending an investigation. Turn in your badges and guns." "Now." Myers nodded, swallowing hard as he placed his badge and gun on the desk. Daniels hesitated, his jaw clenched, but eventually followed suit. As they left the office, Daniels muttered under his breath, "Unbelievable." Myers stopped in his tracks and turned to face Daniels. "You're still not getting it, are you? This isn't about us. It's about what we represent when we put on this uniform. And tonight we failed." Daniels rolled his eyes. "Spare me the lecture." Before Myers could respond, the sound of someone clearing their throat drew their attention. Standing nearby was Officer Martinez, a respected veteran of the precinct. His expression was a mix of disappointment and anger. "You two screwed up big time," Martinez said bluntly. "But let me tell you something. If you don't take this as a wake-up call, you're not just failing this precinct, you're failing the people you're supposed to protect." Daniels brushed past him without a word, his frustration bubbling over. Myers, however, stopped and looked Martinez in the eye. "What would you do if you were in my shoes?" Martinez's gaze softened. "I'd start by owning up to it. Not just to the captain, but to myself. And then I'd figure out how to make it right." Outside the precinct, Daniels stormed toward his car while Myers lingered, his thoughts racing. His mind replayed the events of the night, the look in General Ellis' eyes, the quiet authority in his voice, the disappointment that cut deeper than any shouted reprimand. As he stood there, the sound of approaching footsteps pulled him from his thoughts. It was Officer Martinez. "Hey," Martinez said, his tone softer now. "You're not a bad cop, Myers. But good intentions don't mean anything if your actions don't back them up." Myers nodded slowly. "How do I fix this?" Martinez placed a hand on his shoulder. "You start by listening. To the people you've wronged, to the communities you serve, and to yourself. It's not going to be easy, but it's the only way." As Martinez walked away, Myers glanced toward Daniels' car, where his partner sat fuming. He knew that Daniels wasn't ready to face the truth, but Myers was determined to take the first step. What he didn't know was that the fallout from their actions was just beginning, and that General Ellis had plans of his own. The next morning, the news broke like wildfire. Local and national outlets covered the story of General Warren Ellis, a decorated five-star general, being detained and humiliated by two police officers. Headlines ranged from "War Hero Racially Profiled" to "Cops Arrest Retired General in Shocking Display of Prejudice." Video footage captured by a bystander at the scene circulated widely online. The clip showed Ellis calmly complying with orders as Daniels and Myers escalated the situation. Comments poured in, with outrage dominating the narrative. At the center of it all was Ellis, who remained silent publicly but was already setting a plan into motion behind closed doors. In the luxurious boardroom of a downtown hotel, Ellis sat across from his lawyer, a sharp and confident woman named Angela Bennett. Her reputation as a civil rights attorney was legendary, and she had taken Ellis' case personally. "This isn't just about what happened to me," Ellis said, his tone resolute. "It's about every person who's been treated this way without a voice to fight back." Angela nodded, her pen tapping against her notebook. "Agreed. We're not just filing a complaint. We're going to shine a spotlight on the systemic issues this incident represents. But I need to know, General, how far are you willing to go?" Ellis leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I've fought for this country my entire life, Angela. I'm not about to stop now." Angela smiled faintly. "Good. Because once this goes public, it's going to get messy. The department will push back hard, and you'll be under a microscope." "I've faced worse," Ellis replied simply. Meanwhile, at the police precinct, the atmosphere was tense. Captain Riley had called an emergency meeting with key staff, including Officer Martinez, to discuss damage control. "This isn't just a PR nightmare," Riley said, pacing the room. "This is a reckoning. The video is everywhere, and the public is demanding accountability." Martinez folded his arms. "What's the plan, Captain?" Riley sighed. "Daniels and Myers are suspended, but that's not enough. The department is launching a full investigation. The mayor's office is involved, and there's talk of mandatory bias training across the force." "Good," Martinez said firmly. "It's about time." Riley gave him a sharp look. "Let's not get sanctimonious. This is bigger than just two bad decisions. If we're not careful, this could tear the department apart." "It should," Martinez replied, his voice steady. "If we don't root out this kind of behavior, we're just putting a Band-Aid on a bullet wound." Riley didn't respond, but the weight of Martinez's words lingered. Across town, Myers sat in his small apartment, staring at his phone. He had avoided the news all morning, but curiosity finally got the better of him. He opened the video that had gone viral, his stomach twisting as he watched himself in the footage. There he was, standing by while Daniels shoved Ellis to the ground. The old man's calm demeanor only made their actions look worse. Myers cringed as he saw himself glance away, his silence as damning as Daniels' aggression. The phone buzzed in his hand, jolting him out of his thoughts. It was a text from his younger sister, Claire. Saw the video. What were you thinking? Myers stared at the message for a long moment before typing a response. I wasn't. That's the problem. Before he could hit send, there was a knock at his door. Myers opened it to find Martinez standing there, his expression grim. Can I come in? Martinez asked. Myers nodded and stepped aside. Martinez walked in, glancing around the modest apartment before turning to face him. You've seen the video, haven't you? Martinez asked. Myers nodded. Yeah. It's hard to watch. Martinez raised an eyebrow. Good. It should be. Myers sank onto the couch, rubbing his temples. I messed up, Martinez. I should have stopped Daniels, but I froze. I didn't know what to do. Martinez sat down across from him. You didn't freeze, Myers. You made a choice. And now you have to live with it. Myers looked up, his eyes filled with guilt. How do I make it right? Martinez leaned forward. First, you take responsibility. Publicly, if you have to. Second, you learn from this. And third, you use whatever platform you have to make sure it doesn't happen again. Myers nodded slowly. I want to do that. I really do. But Daniels, he doesn't see it the same way. Then that's on him, Martinez said firmly. You can't control what Daniels does, but you can control what you do. While Myers wrestled with his guilt, Daniels was taking a different approach. Holed up in his apartment, he was glued to his computer, scrolling through comments on the video. The overwhelming condemnation stung, but he zeroed in on the minority of voices defending him. This is all blown out of proportion, one comment read. The general should have just complied. The cops were doing their job. Daniels nodded to himself, muttering, exactly. He scrolled further, his frustration growing. They're making me out to be a villain, he said aloud. This is a witch hunt. As his anger boiled over, Daniels grabbed his phone and called a friend who worked as a local journalist. You want a story? He asked. I've got one for you. The truth. Meanwhile, Ellis prepared for the Veterans Gala, where he was slated to speak that evening. Despite the chaos of the past 24 hours, he was focused on the bigger picture. Standing in front of a mirror, he adjusted his tie and glanced at Angela, who was reviewing notes for his speech. They'll be watching tonight, Angela said. Every word you say will be scrutinized. Good, Ellis replied. Because I have something to say. As the gala began, cameras flashed and reporters swarmed, eager to capture Ellis' first public statement since the incident. The room buzzed with anticipation as Ellis took the stage, his commanding presence silencing the crowd. He paused for a moment, scanning the audience before speaking. Last night, I experienced something I've fought against my entire life, a reminder that even the highest rank doesn't shield you from prejudice. But this isn't just about me. It's about a system that allows this to happen to countless others who don't have a platform to fight back. The room erupted in applause, but Ellis raised a hand to quiet them. This is a moment for change. Not just in policing, but in how we see and treat one another. It starts here. It starts now. As his words echoed through the hall, Ellis knew this was only the beginning of the battle. The Veterans Gala speech sent shockwaves through the media. General Ellis' words were broadcasted nationwide, sparking debates on every major news channel and igniting conversations online. Social media exploded with hashtags like #JusticeForEllis and #EndRacial Profiling, as people from all walks of life shared their stories of prejudice and discrimination. Ellis, however, remained composed amid the storm. He knew this wasn't about making headlines, it was about pushing for real change. But as the public rallied behind him, tensions at the precinct reached a boiling point. Inside the precinct's break room, a heated argument broke out between officers. Martinez stood on one side, his arms crossed, while a small group of officers, led by Daniels, stood on the other. This is ridiculous, Daniels spat, his face flushed with anger. They're treating us like criminals for doing our job. Martinez raised an eyebrow. Your job? Your job is to protect and serve, not to humiliate and degrade. Daniels scoffed. Easy for you to say, Martinez. You weren't there. You didn't see how suspicious he looked. Suspicious? Martinez shot back. He was a man stranded on the side of the road. The only thing suspicious about him was the color of his skin in your eyes. The room fell silent as Martinez's words landed like a hammer. Daniels clenched his fists, his voice rising. You don't know what it's like out there. Every day, we're targets. We have to make split-second decisions. And in your split second, you chose prejudice, Martinez said coldly. That's the problem. Before Daniels could respond, the door opened, and Captain Riley stepped in. His face was lined with exhaustion, but his voice carried authority. Enough. This precinct is under enough scrutiny without you two tearing it apart. Martinez and Daniels glared at each other but stayed silent. Riley looked at Daniels. You've been talking to reporters, haven't you? Daniels hesitated but didn't deny it. I told them my side of the story. Riley sighed, pinching the bridge of his nose. Your side of the story is only making things worse. The department is already under fire, and now you've painted a target on yourself. Daniels folded his arms. So what? I'm not going to sit back and let them destroy my reputation. Riley's voice dropped, low and dangerous. Your reputation isn't the priority here. The integrity of this department is. And right now, you're dragging it through the mud. Martinez watched silently, his jaw tight. He didn't feel sympathy for Daniels, but he couldn't deny the captain's words. The entire department was paying for two men's actions, and it was clear the fallout was far from over. Meanwhile, Myers sat alone at a diner across town. He picked at his plate of cold fries, his mind racing. The viral video had forced him to confront truths he had spent years avoiding. For the first time, he was questioning everything: his decisions, his training, and the very system he had sworn to uphold. The doorbell chimed, and Myers looked up to see Martinez walking in. Myers nodded in acknowledgement as Martinez slid into the booth across from him. I figured I'd find you here, Martinez said. Myers managed a weak smile. I needed to get away from the station. Martinez studied him for a moment. You're taking this hard. Shouldn't I be? Myers replied. I screwed up, Martinez. And now it's not just me paying for it, it's everyone. Martinez leaned back, his expression thoughtful. You're right. But the question is, what are you going to do about it? Myers sighed. I don't know. Apologizing doesn't feel like enough. It's not, Martinez said bluntly. But it's a start. And you can't stop there. You need to learn from this and use it to be better. Myers nodded slowly. You think I should reach out to Ellis? Martinez shrugged. That's up to you. But if you do, make sure it's not just about clearing your conscience. Make it about understanding, about listening. Myers stared at his coffee, his thoughts churning. Do you think he'd even talk to me? Martinez's lips twitched into a faint smile. The general strikes me as the kind of man who'd listen, if you're sincere. Later that night, Myers sat in his car, staring at the contact information he had pulled up for Ellis. His heart pounded as he debated whether to call. Finally, he took a deep breath and pressed the dial button. The phone rang twice before a deep, familiar voice answered. This is General Ellis. Myers hesitated, his throat dry. General, this is Officer Myers. I was one of the officers at the scene the other night. There was a pause, and Myers braced himself for a harsh response. Instead, Ellis' voice was calm. I see. What can I do for you, officer? I wanted to apologize, Myers said, his words tumbling out in a rush. For what happened? For not stopping it. For everything. Ellis was silent for a moment before responding. Do you understand why what you did was wrong? Myers nodded, though he knew Ellis couldn't see him. Yes, I do. And I want to learn how to make it right. Ellis' tone softened slightly. Acknowledging your mistakes is a good first step, Officer Myers. But real change comes from action. Are you willing to take that step? Yes, Myers said without hesitation. Whatever it takes. Ellis paused, then said, Meet me tomorrow morning. I'll send you the address. Myers felt a mix of relief and apprehension as he ended the call. He didn't know what Ellis had planned, but he knew this was the beginning of a journey he couldn't afford to shy away from. The next morning, Myers arrived at the address Ellis had sent him, a community center in the heart of a predominantly black neighborhood. Ellis greeted him at the entrance, his presence as commanding as ever. "You're here," Ellis said simply. "Yes, sir," Myers replied. Ellis gestured for him to follow. Inside, the center was bustling with activity. Children playing, volunteers organizing supplies, and families gathering for a meal. Ellis led Myers to a small conference room and closed the door. "This isn't just about you or me," Ellis began. "It's about understanding the experiences of those you're supposed to protect. And it starts with listening." He motioned to a circle of chairs, where several community members were waiting. "This is where you begin." As Myers sat down, the faces around him were a mix of skepticism and hope. The first question came quickly: "Why should we trust you?" Myers swallowed hard, his voice steady but honest. "You shouldn't. Not yet. But I'm here to listen, and I'm here to learn." Ellis watched silently from the corner of the room, his expression unreadable. Myers knew he was being tested, not just by the community, but by himself. This was only the beginning of a long road. Have you ever been in a situation where someone's actions changed your perspective? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you're finding this story interesting, hit the like button and subscribe to our channel. The room was silent as Myers sat in the circle, surrounded by faces etched with skepticism and quiet anger. The air was heavy, the weight of generations of mistrust pressing down on him. General Ellis stood at the back, his arms crossed, watching intently. This wasn't just a moment for Myers, it was a reckoning for everyone involved. A woman in her 40s, with sharp eyes and a voice that carried authority, was the first to speak. "Officer Myers, you say you're here to listen and learn. But how do we know this isn't just damage control? How do we know you're not just trying to save face?" Myers shifted uncomfortably but met her gaze. "You don't. I can't expect you to trust me after what I was part of. All I can do is show you that I'm serious, by being here, by listening, and by doing better." The woman leaned back, arms crossed, clearly unconvinced. A younger man, barely in his 20s, spoke up next. "You know what it feels like to be stopped and questioned for no reason? To be treated like a suspect just because of how you look? Because that's my reality every day." Myers nodded slowly, his voice low. "I don't know what that feels like. But I want to understand." "You want to understand?" the man shot back, his voice rising. "Do you know how many people don't get the chance to explain themselves? How many don't get the chance to walk away?" Myers flinched at the raw emotion in the man's voice. "You're right. I can't undo what's happened. But I can try to make sure it doesn't keep happening." The conversation grew more intense as others shared their stories. Each account hit Myers like a hammer, stories of humiliation, fear, and loss. He listened intently, his own guilt growing with every word. Outside the conference room, Ellis watched through the window, his expression unreadable. Angela Bennett, who had joined him that morning, stood at his side. "Do you think he's genuine?" Angela asked. Ellis didn't respond immediately. "Finally," he said, "he's here. That's more than most would do. But it's what he does after this that matters." Angela nodded. "And Daniels?" Ellis' jaw tightened. "Daniels isn't ready. He's too focused on justifying his actions to see the bigger picture." Angela sighed. "He's a liability, Warren. If he keeps doubling down, he'll take the whole department with him." Ellis turned to her, his voice firm. "Then we deal with him too." Meanwhile, Daniels was doing exactly what Ellis had anticipated, doubling down. Sitting in a local news studio, he faced a sympathetic interviewer who had given him a platform to share his side of the story. "I'm not saying we're perfect," Daniels said, leaning forward. "But the narrative being pushed here is completely unfair. We're out there risking our lives every day, and now we're being vilified for doing our jobs." The interviewer nodded, offering him an encouraging smile. "What do you say to those who accuse you of racial profiling?" Daniels scoffed. "I say they don't understand what it's like to be in our shoes. We have to make split-second decisions, and sometimes things aren't as clear-cut as people watching from the sidelines think." The interview aired later that evening, and the backlash was swift. Social media erupted, with many calling Daniels' words a thinly veiled excuse for his actions. Others defended him, claiming he was being unfairly targeted. The divide grew deeper, with Daniels at the center of the storm. Back at the community center, the session continued. By the end, Myers felt emotionally drained but also more aware than he ever had before. As the group began to disperse, a young girl approached him. She couldn't have been more than 10 years old, her big brown eyes filled with curiosity and a hint of caution. "Are you really going to change?" she asked quietly. Myers knelt to meet her gaze. "I'm going to try my best." "That's a promise." The girl studied him for a moment before nodding. "Okay. But don't break your promise." Ellis stepped forward as the girl walked away, his voice breaking the silence. "You held your own in there." Myers looked up at the general, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Do you think they believed me?" Ellis' expression softened slightly. "Some did. Others didn't. Trust isn't given freely, it's earned. This is just the first step." Myers nodded, his resolve hardening. "What's the next step?" Ellis placed a hand on his shoulder. "You'll see soon enough." That evening, Ellis and Angela hosted a press conference to address the ongoing controversy. The room was packed with reporters, their cameras trained on the podium. Ellis stepped forward, his commanding presence silencing the crowd. "Good evening," he began. Over the past few days, this incident has sparked a national conversation about policing, prejudice, and accountability. And while I am grateful for the support I've received, this isn't just about me. It's about addressing a system that allows these injustices to persist. He paused, letting his words sink in. "I've spoken with Officer Myers, who has shown a willingness to learn and grow from this experience. But I must also address Officer Daniels, whose recent statements show a refusal to take responsibility. This cannot stand." The room erupted with questions, but Ellis held up a hand for silence. "I'm not here to tear people down. I'm here to build a bridge to understanding. That starts with accountability. I'm calling for immediate reforms within the police department, starting with comprehensive bias training and independent oversight." Angela stepped forward, adding, "And we'll be filing a formal complaint with the Department of Justice to ensure these reforms are not just promises, but actions." As the press conference concluded, the room buzzed with energy. Ellis had made his position clear. This was no longer just a personal matter. It was a fight for systemic change. Across town, Daniels watched the press conference with growing anger. His jaw tightened as Ellis called him out by name, and his grip on the remote control turned his knuckles white. "This isn't over," he muttered, a dangerous glint in his eyes. But what Daniels didn't know was that Ellis was prepared for whatever came next, and he wasn't alone in the fight. Daniels' anger simmered as he replayed the press conference in his mind. He sat in his dimly lit apartment, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table in front of him. Ellis' words echoed in his ears. "This cannot stand." It felt personal, like a challenge, and Daniels wasn't about to back down. Grabbing his phone, he called a former academy buddy who had connections in the local police union. "Mick, it's Daniels," he said, his voice slurring slightly. "I need a favor." "What kind of favor?" Mick replied cautiously. "The department's hanging me out to dry," Daniels growled. "I need to fight back, and I need backup." Mick hesitated. "Look, Daniels, this is messy. You sure you want to go down this road?" "Messy?" Daniels snapped. "They're dragging my name through the mud. I won't just sit here and take it." Mick sighed. "All right. Let me see what I can do." Daniels hung up, a grim smile tugging at his lips. If Ellis wanted a fight, Daniels was ready. At the community center, Myers returned for another meeting with General Ellis and the group. This time, Ellis invited him to stay after the session. As the others left, Ellis motioned for Myers to follow him into a private office. Inside, Ellis gestured to a chair, and Myers sat down, his nerves evident. "You're making progress," Ellis said, leaning against the desk. "Thanks," Myers replied. "But it still feels like I've barely scratched the surface." Ellis nodded. "Because you have. Understanding this isn't something that happens overnight. It's a lifelong process." Myers shifted uncomfortably. "I want to do more. What can I do next?" Ellis studied him for a moment before responding. "There's a rally tomorrow, organized by the families of people who've been victims of police brutality. I'll be speaking there, and I want you to come." Myers hesitated. "You think that's a good idea? A cop showing up at a rally like that?" "I think it's the right idea," Ellis replied firmly. "If you're serious about change, you need to face the people you failed. Not just in a meeting like this, but out there in the real world." Myers nodded slowly. "I'll be there." The next day, the rally took place in a park downtown. A crowd of hundreds gathered, holding signs and chanting for justice. The energy was electric, both hopeful and angry, a powerful mix of emotions. Ellis stood at the center of the stage, his presence commanding as always. He began his speech with his usual calm authority, recounting the incident and tying it to the larger issues of systemic racism and accountability. As he spoke, Myers arrived, standing at the edge of the crowd. He felt out of place, his uniform a stark contrast to the civilians around him. But he stayed, listening intently as Ellis called for reform. Near the end of the speech, Ellis motioned toward Myers, catching him off guard. "Today, we have someone here who's taken a step toward understanding. Officer Myers, would you join me?" The crowd murmured as Myers hesitated, then made his way to the stage. He could feel hundreds of eyes on him, their scrutiny cutting deep. As he reached Ellis, the general spoke again. "Officer Myers has acknowledged his mistakes and committed to making things right. He's here not as a symbol of the problem, but as a sign that change is possible, if we demand it." Ellis handed Myers the microphone. For a moment, Myers froze, unsure of what to say. Then he took a deep breath and spoke. "I know I've let people down," he began, his voice shaky. "And I know an apology isn't enough. But I'm here because I want to learn. I want to do better, not just for myself, but for the community I'm supposed to serve." The crowd was silent, their expressions a mix of skepticism and curiosity. Myers continued, his voice gaining strength. "I can't undo what's been done, but I can work to make sure it doesn't happen again. And I'm asking for your help to hold me accountable." Ellis nodded approvingly as Myers handed back the microphone. The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some applauded cautiously, others crossed their arms in silence. But Myers felt a small glimmer of hope. This was a step forward, even if it was just the beginning. Meanwhile, Daniel's plan was in motion. He and Mick had rallied a small group of officers sympathetic to his cause, framing the situation as an attack on law enforcement. They released a statement to the press, accusing Ellis of using the incident for personal gain and claiming Myers had been coerced into his actions. The media picked up the story, and the narrative began to shift. Commentators debated whether Ellis was a hero or an opportunist, while Daniels doubled down on his defiance. But Ellis wasn't deterred. He had seen battles like this before, fought on different fields but with the same stakes. As he prepared for the next step in his plan, he knew the fight was far from over. That night, Ellis received an unexpected call from Angela. "Warren," she said, her voice urgent. "You need to see this." She sent him a link to a news segment where Daniels accused Ellis of staging the incident to further his own agenda. The footage showed Daniels speaking confidently, painting himself as the victim. Ellis watched in silence, his expression unreadable. Finally, he spoke. "If Daniels wants a fight, he's going to get one." Angela's voice was cautious. "What's the plan?" Ellis leaned back in his chair, his voice steady. "We let him talk. The truth will speak louder." As the divide between Daniels and Ellis widened, Myers found himself caught in the middle. He watched the news with growing unease, realizing that this wasn't just about one incident anymore. It was a battle for the soul of the system he had once believed in. The next morning, Myers showed up at Ellis' door unannounced. "I want to help," he said, his voice firm. Ellis studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Then let's get to work." The battle lines were drawn. General Ellis represented a movement calling for justice and systemic change, while Daniels entrenched himself in the narrative of victimized law enforcement. The tension reached its peak as the public, the media, and the police department itself found themselves polarized. Ellis, however, remained steadfast. His strategy was clear: let the truth shine through the noise. With Angela Bennett by his side, he prepared for a public forum that would be broadcast nationwide. The event, titled Bridging the Divide, was intended to confront the issues head-on and give both sides a chance to speak. Daniels had been invited, but he refused, claiming it was a public ambush. On the night of the forum, the atmosphere was electric. Hundreds gathered in the auditorium, while millions tuned in from home. Ellis walked onto the stage to a standing ovation, but his expression remained serious. He wasn't here for applause, he was here to push for change. Angela moderated the event, her voice firm but measured. Tonight, we're here to discuss not just what happened to General Ellis, but the broader implications for policing, justice, and community trust. Ellis began by recounting the events of that night, his voice calm but firm. He spoke not of anger, but of the systemic issues that allowed prejudice to persist. This isn't about one officer or one incident, he said. It's about a culture that sees blackness as a threat and allows implicit bias to go unchecked. Myers was the next to speak. Sitting on stage beside Ellis, he looked nervous but determined. "I was wrong," he said, his voice cracking. "I failed in my duty that night, not just to General Ellis, but to the community I swore to protect. And I'm here because I want to be part of the solution." His admission drew murmurs from the audience, but Angela quickly redirected the discussion. "Officer Myers, what do you believe needs to change within law enforcement to prevent incidents like this?" "Accountability," Myers said without hesitation. "We need better training, but more than that, we need to hold each other accountable. The culture has to shift. It's not enough to say, 'I'm not racist.' We have to actively work against prejudice in every form." As the forum continued, Daniels watched from his apartment, his face a mask of anger. Mick sat beside him, trying to placate him. "Let it go, man. You're only making yourself look worse." Daniels ignored him, muttering to himself, "This is all a setup. They're making us the villains." Mick sighed. "Maybe it's time to admit we made a mistake." Daniels glared at him. "You're just like Myers, weak." Mick stood, shaking his head. "You're going to self-destruct, Daniels. Don't say I didn't warn you." The turning point came near the end of the forum, when Angela opened the floor to audience questions. A young man stood, his voice shaking as he addressed Ellis. "General, my brother didn't survive his encounter with the police. He wasn't a general. He didn't have medals or a platform. How do we make sure his story matters too?" Ellis paused, his expression softening. "Your brother's story does matter," he said gently. "Every story matters. And the only way to honor him is to fight for a world where no one else has to experience that kind of loss. This fight isn't about rank or medals, it's about humanity." The audience erupted into applause, and the young man nodded, tears streaming down his face. Myers, sitting beside Ellis, felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about redemption, it was about building something better. The next morning, Daniel's world began to crumble. The department's internal investigation concluded, finding that both he and Myers had violated protocol. While Myers' cooperation and willingness to learn earned him a second chance with mandatory retraining and community service, Daniels faced harsher consequences. His refusal to take responsibility and inflammatory public statements led to his termination. Daniels stormed out of the precinct, his bitterness palpable. He called a press conference of his own, railing against the department and Ellis, but the public's patience for his excuses had worn thin. The media shifted focus, leaving Daniels shouting into the void. Months later, Ellis' efforts began to bear fruit. The police department implemented mandatory bias training, established an independent oversight committee, and began community outreach programs. Myers became an integral part of these efforts, working alongside Ellis and others to bridge the divide between law enforcement and the community. At the community center, Myers helped organize a youth mentorship program. One afternoon, the young girl who had asked him about his promise approached him again. "Are you keeping your promise?" she asked, her eyes full of hope. Myers knelt, looking her in the eye. "I'm trying every day. And I won't stop." Ellis watched from a distance, a faint smile on his face. The journey was far from over, but the seeds of change had been planted. In the end, Ellis reflected on the events that had unfolded. One night of injustice had sparked a movement, proving that even in the face of adversity, progress was possible. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't quick, but it was a step toward a better future. And for General Warren Ellis, the fight for justice wasn't a duty, it was a calling. Thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe.